Hello and welcome to Reverie True Crime. I'm your host, Paige. Today's episode takes us to Wenatchee, Washington, where a cosmetology student's short dash for coffee turned into a mystery for a short time. Ultimately, the tragic answers would shake the whole community to its core. When it came to the person who was accused of what happened to this young woman, it left a community and people around the world divided. Some thought the person without a doubt was guilty. Others were fighting to get the case reopened, believing the person who was serving the time didn't do the crime. This is the story of Mackenzie Cowell and the beauty school killer. Mackenzie Cowell was born on April 1st, 1992, to Reed and Wendy Cowell in Wenatchee, Washington and Chelan County. She was living with her mother in Wenatchee part-time and her father in Orondo part-time in 2010, the year this tragedy occurred. Mackenzie was only 17 years old. She was attending high school at Wenatchee High School, as well as studying cosmetology at the Wenatchee Academy of Hair Design. At her high school, she was on the dance team, and she was employed as a model. On February 9th, 2010, Mackenzie went to her cosmetology class, expecting it to be like any other day. A little after 3 p.m., she said she was going to grab a coffee from her favorite coffee shop, saying she would be back in about 15 minutes. Surveillance footage showed that she sauntered out of the Academy of Hair Design to her car and she drove away. As she was leaving, she texted her boyfriend, Joaquin Villasano, saying, "Hey, what's up?" At almost 6 p.m., Mackenzie's father tried calling and calling her, but he kept getting sent to her voicemail. By 8 p.m., her curfew which she never missed, she still wasn't home. This made her family feel uneasy and worried. A few hours later, someone called the police in Chelan County to report a car that had been deserted right by their driveway in Pitcher Canyon near Mission Ridge. The 1997 Pontiac Grand Prix belonged to Mackenzie's father. When the police contacted him about the car being abandoned and locked, he told them his daughter never came home. Left in the vehicle were some of Mackenzie's clothes and purse, but her debit card and LG NV2 cell phone were gone. There was only one set of footprints beside the car. The Chelan County's Sheriff's Office got to work right away to investigate Mackenzie's suspicious disappearance. On February 13th, a multi-agency police group formed a task force who led the investigation. This included law enforcement from Wenatchee and East Wenatchee, as well as Douglas County and Chelan County. 2 officials from U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement and an agent from the FBI also helped out. Not since someone tried to commit a serial bombing in the Wenatchee area in 1997 had the community seen such a huge investigation. It was the largest multi-agency investigation since the 1997 incident. Also on the 13th, a spokesperson for the Chelan County Sheriff's Department said they had search warrants for Mackenzie's MySpace and Facebook social media accounts, as well as her Verizon phone records, in hopes that it would lead them in a good direction and give them something to work off of. They did find that the last location pinged placed her phone at the boat launching location of Riverfront Park at 3:40 p.m. on the 9th. The next day, the Longview Daily newspaper reported that a fully clothed body with its feet in the water had been found on the bank of the Columbia River at Crescent Bar by someone who was strolling along the riverside around 12:45 in the afternoon. Police arrived at 2 p.m., and shortly after looking at the body, they deemed the death a homicide. The body wasn't positively confirmed to be Mackenzie, but officials treated the situation like it was her. Due to the victim's looks and a detective who had been working on the case who viewed the body, they were all positive it was Mackenzie. However, they wouldn't know for sure until the autopsy was done. The young woman's body was 20 miles away from Wenatchee, but very close to a home that was for sale 50 yards away. It was also concluded that the body had not been there the whole time, and someone had placed the young woman there, but police wouldn't say how long they predicted she had been there. A lot of information they kept close to the vest at this time, including the murder weapon. The body was found on the 13th, and that night, Sheriff Harvey Jesdahl said they wouldn't have a positive identification for a few days when the autopsy was completed. The autopsy was scheduled for the 16th, and there would be a team of forensic experts from the State Patrol's crime lab conducting an examination as well. When the sheriff was asked if this could have been done by a complete stranger, he answered, quote, "We just don't know. It's a pretty fresh investigation." On the 15th, dive teams were out searching the body of water where the young woman's body was discovered, as well as a few smaller bodies of water around the area. The sheriff stated, quote, "We're looking for trace evidence, impressions, anything that would help us determine the circumstances of this woman's death." The neighborhood of Crescent Bar was also being combed thoroughly by investigators, and they were asking everyone around if they had seen anything unusual in the last week or so. Investigators also canvassed around the area of the coffee shop that Mackenzie was headed to the day she went missing, finding out that she never made it there to get any coffee. The autopsy was completed by the 19th, but the police department thought they would hold off on telling anyone many details. The body was confirmed to be Mackenzie's as suspected. On February 19th, investigators decided to circulate to the public through the media the video footage of Mackenzie leaving the parking lot of the cosmetology school. Investigation Task Force spokesman Doug Jones said, quote, "It is our hope that the release of this video footage will assist in generating additional tips from the public regarding the circumstances surrounding her disappearance and subsequent murder." Specifically, authorities wanted to know if anyone saw a person or persons walking down Pitcher Canyon, Squilchuck Road, or south end of Mathau Street between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m. on February 9th, because that is when they believed the car that she was driving was deserted. So far, the police were being so tight-lipped about everything. They didn't reveal her cause of death. They wouldn't say if there were more footprints anywhere, if the footprints by the car were Mackenzie's, or address rumors of tire tracks by the scene on the riverbank. Everything was very hush-hush. Residents around the area were reporting suspicious looks, suspicious cars, suspicious noises, and abandoned vehicles that people would normally just pass by without a second thought were being reported frequently. People were becoming hyper-aware of their surroundings, and so much seemed off since the discovery of Mackenzie, and at no fault of their own, residents may have been so on edge that harmless things even seem to have been done with not so great intentions. People were rightfully spooked. One person, or possibly more than one person, had murdered a young woman, and they had not been caught. Everyone was tense. One woman called the police because a man in a Chevy truck was staring at her. When the police went to the location to talk to the man, he was just innocently parked, waiting for his girlfriend. Another person reported a cream-colored truck that was parked under a tree by the library because it looked similar to a truck seen in the video footage of the cosmetology school parking lot. Police Sergeant Cherie Smith said, quote, "People are on high alert. There are just more calls than we usually would get on generally suspicious stuff. People are being more aware." There were a lot of tips pouring in since the release of the surveillance video from the Academy of Hair Design. Police thought it was a good thing that people were being more aware of what goes on around them. The whole area was still seen as a danger to the public because there were no suspects and no one knew if the killer or killers had left the area or were right under their noses. At first, the two people police really focused on were Mackenzie's boyfriend, Joaquin Villasano, and her mother Wendy's boyfriend, Joey Fisher. When asked if he knew what happened to Mackenzie during a polygraph test, Joaquin answered no. He failed the polygraph. Joey and Mackenzie had supposedly gotten into an argument the day before she vanished. Later, both Joey and Joaquin were cleared of any wrongdoing. A police informant, former drug dealer, and college student Liz Reed went to the police with what seemed like a very viable lead. She told them that San Cuevas and Emmanuel Serros, two known drug dealers, thought Mackenzie was an informant and murdered her in a case of mistaken identity. Liz told the officers that she had watched a video of the killing and allegedly Sam told her, quote, "I choked that bitch to shut her up." Before the murder weapon became public knowledge, Liz described it to officers accurately. She even gave them a ring that she said was from the scene of the crime belonging to Mackenzie. She claimed Emmanuel forced her to go there and told her not to come back without it. Though no one in Mackenzie's family had ever seen this ring before and didn't think it belonged to Mackenzie. Liz would later retract her confessed allegation of watching a snuff film of the murder, and she didn't seem as credible as she did in the beginning. When Sam and Emmanuel were questioned, they both had alibis that checked out. They had witnesses, statements, and phone records that proved they were nowhere near Mackenzie at the time of her disappearance. On February 25th, almost 2,000 people showed up to Mackenzie's memorial at the Town Toyota Center in Wenatchee. In March, the reward for helping authorities find Mackenzie's killer skyrocketed to $40,000. On March 13th, details of Mackenzie's death certificate were leaked to the public by the Wenatchee World. Even though it was public record, police did not want those details released yet. It was revealed to everyone that Mackenzie's cause of death was manual strangulation and stab wound to the neck, as well as a contributing factor being blunt impact to the head. It did note that Mackenzie did not suffer, saying the time interval from when the murderous violence began to the time she passed away was very brief. When investigators say they don't want details to be released to the public, there is a good reason for that. Some people say journalists will be journalists, but it's still not ethical, and it can damage an investigation when people do things like this. Though authorities said that would not deter them from solving Mackenzie's case. Cal Fitzsimmons, the managing editor for the Wenatchee World, said, quote, "The World has always published the cause of death in murder investigations as soon as it becomes available. We held off for 2 weeks in this case at the request of investigators. We do not see any compelling reason to continue to withhold that information from the public, and we certainly do not believe it will hinder law enforcement in its efforts to catch the killer." The Douglas County coroner and prosecutor Steve Clem said when the autopsy was finished, he would not be releasing the cause of death because no one wanted that to happen until a suspect was identified and charged. Steve would not even comment on the release of the death certificate. Even though those details were released, there were still a few details the public did not know yet, such as, post-mortem, the killer stuck around and tried to cut one of Mackenzie's arms off, but they gave up, plunging the knife into her shoulder and leaving it there. There was no evidence of sexual assault. By the month of May, the reward for information leading to Mackenzie's killer was up to $47,000. At this point, officers had looked into more than 400 tips and leads and interviewed over 700 people, but more tips were needed. In July, the Homicide Task Force released information about the murder weapon. It was a big risk, but they were hoping it would result in a bigger reward and would be worth it. The knife the perpetrator used on Mackenzie was made by the brand Maxim and had a unique handle that was black and gray. This knife came from a limited set that was only sold in one store in all of Wenatchee, Stan's Mary Mart. There were still no suspects yet, but with this huge piece of evidence now being put out there, they hoped it would conjure up a few leads. A few tips came in about one other person, and in August, a letter was received at the police station. Someone wrote that Mackenzie's 29-year-old classmate at the Academy of Hair Design, Christopher Scott Wilson, had, quote, "an obsession with death, dead bodies, and serial killers." When other classmates were interviewed, officers were told that Christopher had been employed at several funeral homes in the past, which wouldn't be weird at all, except he would outright tell people that while he worked at those funeral homes, he enjoyed cutting people up. One witness said Christopher attempted to choke a female friend. Another woman told police that Christopher was employed at a hotel once, and he supposedly confessed to her that he strangled one of the guests with a belt. This allegedly happened in Ellensburg, and while investigating, police didn't find any unsolved murders in that area. Rick Phillips, a funeral home owner, talked about Christopher working at his funeral home back in 2004 as an embalmer. He told the Wenatchee World that Christopher was a good employee, but after a couple of months went by, quote, "some things started to take place and we let him go. I started becoming uncomfortable, but he didn't do anything real bad." Rick would not go any further into what he meant by that. While investigators were looking into him and his possible involvement, they discovered that Christopher exited the school not long after Mackenzie. A handful of witnesses also said where the Pontiac Grand Prix had been deserted, they saw a man near there who matched the description of Christopher. 2 months later, on October 6, 2010, Christopher was arrested while he was at his home on suspicion of second-degree murder. Investigators found duct tape near Mackenzie's body and sent it off for DNA testing. DNA on the duct tape was a match to Christopher. Sergeant John Cruz, who spoke on behalf of the task force, now named the Cowell Homicide Task Force, said, quote, Christopher Wilson was contacted along with other students at the school and gave a voluntary DNA sample to investigators. In addition to his DNA, blood from Mackenzie Cowell was also found on this piece of duct tape. The DNA results came back on September 23rd, but they wanted to wait a few days to get more work done before making the arrest. They wanted to have all of their ducks in a row before they made such a big move. Christopher's bail was $1 million as he was being held in the Chelan County Regional Justice Center. At a preliminary hearing, he was represented by a public defender, Keith Howard. Christopher told the court he wasn't receiving any income at the time to pay a lawyer. Both the public defender and Christopher's mother, Kathleen Zorns, declined to comment after the hearing was over. At that point, Christopher was charged by Chelan County prosecutor Gary Reeson for killing Mackenzie Cowell on February 9th in a 2-page document that did not reveal many other details. So far, no motive for the crime was known. However, when Sergeant John Cruz was asked if any other arrests were going to be made, he responded, quote, "We're not prepared to comment on that at this time." He did say that several search warrants had been issued by investigators concerning Christopher, and they were continuing to interview potential witnesses for more information. When Christopher's apartment was searched, there were bloodstains in the carpet padding. Investigators were not sure at first if the carpet that was on top of the padding had been replaced or if the blood was even from a human being. The blood would be DNA tested to figure that out. The News Tribune reported on the 10th of October that police said Christopher may have had romantic feelings for Mackenzie, but they did not elaborate any further. Also, officers made another discovery in a stairwell of a basement apartment right under Christopher's mother's salon. Blood smears and spatter. Police did confirm that Mackenzie had spent some of her nights in that basement apartment. Friends of Christopher said that he was a funny person, really sweet and caring. Danica Stephen, who had lived in Wenatchee and moved to Seattle, recalled how she knew Christopher, and he wasn't some dark, sinister character he was being portrayed as, and he wasn't a gothic blood monster. After the blood from the carpet padding was DNA tested, it came back as a match to Mackenzie. Prosecutor Gary filed an enhancement on October 20th, 2010 to the second-degree murder charge, which would be a life sentence for Christopher if he were to be convicted. Christopher pleaded not guilty to the murder charge in the packed courtroom during his arraignment. He also waived his right to a speedy trial. Judge John Bridges scheduled the trial to begin on March 8, 2011. The commander of the task force, Robin Wagg, believed Mackenzie had been slain by Christopher in his apartment. In December, someone else was arrested by the task force. 22-year-old Tessa Marie Schuleman. She was a friend of Christopher's and accused of helping him cover up the murder. Pictures that were found on Christopher's computer included images of Tessa posing on the floor like a deceased person right on top of the bloodstains. She told the police she was unconscious when those pictures were taken by Christopher, and she had absolutely no idea there were bloodstains underneath where she was laying. There were also other videos and photos on Tessa's iPhone and computer, but she said Christopher was just a good friend. She and Christopher had texted each other around the time that it was believed Mackenzie was killed, but the details of those texts, police said, were not yet known. Tessa swore she did not know Christopher was capable of doing what he was being accused of. Investigators said Tessa had been questioned after Christopher Wilson was arrested, and she came to her interview with Christopher's grandfather. She told the authorities that she had, quote, no recollection of the events surrounding Mackenzie Cowell's disappearance and murder in February, and no information regarding Christopher Wilson's involvement in Mackenzie's death. Upon further investigation, however, that didn't appear to be the truth. On June 26th, over 4 months after the murder, she had a video on her phone where she was walking into Christopher's apartment, but what she did next was strange. Tessa moved Christopher's coffee table over and focused her phone camera on the visible, dried bloodstains. Another video was taken on June 30th, where Christopher asked Tessa if the apartment was clean. Tessa responded, quote, considering what happened, It seemed as if she was going to say, considering what happened, but corrected herself. At the end of this video, she takes her phone and focuses on the spot on the carpet where bloodstains were later found embedded into the carpet padding. It was as if she was showing how well she cleaned that specific spot because the bloodstain was not as visible as it was on the video taken on the 26th. Tessa allegedly told her boyfriend that Christopher had instructed her to lay down in that spot and pose as a deceased person, but she had no idea why. Tessa was being held in jail on a $29,000 bail on suspicion of first-degree rendering criminal assistance and obstructing a police officer. She did post a percentage of the bail so she could leave the Chelan County Regional Justice Center. Tessa was charged with obstruction of justice in Grant County unrelated to Mackenzie's case. She had a warrant issued for her arrest in Grant County on November 18th for misdemeanor criminal assistance, making false statements to a public servant, and obstructing a public officer. These are all misdemeanor charges. Sergeant Doug Jones said the Department of Corrections had been seeking Tessa out for, quote, something to do with concealing or not giving information on someone they were looking for. What I found was that Tessa had been accused of hiding her friend or possible boyfriend, Adam Olson, in a shop building and told the police he wasn't there, and she didn't know where he was. When she thought the police were gone, she went to the shop and opened the door. Police saw Adam inside, and they were caught. Tessa Schuleman was scheduled to be in court on January 24, 2011 in Grant County. She was sentenced in March of 2011 to 1 day with a county work crew. In 2012, the Grant County Superior Court judge overturned the obstruction verdict and sent the false statement charge back for reconsideration for the lower court. There was never any forensic evidence that tied Tessa to Mackenzie's murder or a possible cover-up of the murder, so she was never charged with anything in the case of Mackenzie Cowell. Christopher was also adamant about the stain on the floor being water from a marijuana bong that was spilled. Christopher's trial date was changed to start in May instead of March. He was granted continuance to May 19th, 12 days before the scheduled trial date. However, prosecutor Gary Reeson and Christopher's public defender Keith Howard did not think that the May 31st trial date gave them enough time to pull all of their research, evidence, and statements together. The attorneys on both sides would have to get together to figure out a new starting date for the trial. In April of 2011, prosecuting attorneys decided to charge Christopher with first-degree murder instead of second, due to his actions indicating it was a premeditated killing. Fast forward to a year later, May 21st of 2012, and jury selection began. Christopher decided to turn down a damn good plea deal after his defense team won the major pretrial motions. If he would have pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter, he only would have spent 6.5 years in prison. John Henry Brown, a well-established and known attorney out of Seattle, was the head of Christopher's defense team. John had represented people who made international headlines, such as Ted Bundy, Colton Harris Moore, and others. Regarding maintaining his innocence, even when he could have taken the plea deal, John Brown called it a big risk, but he admired Christopher for it. Though in the same breath he said, quote, "I'm very worried that he's turned down an offer that was very, very reasonable." John's plan was to argue that Mackenzie's blood had been sneaked into Christopher's apartment and planted there. John claimed that if Christopher was guilty, more blood would have been found in his apartment, as violent and gruesome as the killing was. The News Tribune reported on May 20th, 2011, statements from Reed Cowell, Mackenzie's father. He reminisced about his driven daughter, who had what he called an unreal schedule. Reed said Mackenzie was going to high school in the mornings, cosmetology school in the afternoons, and juggling dance classes and dance team practices. She was a very busy and hard-working young woman. Her father said, quote, "She would never have gone with anyone she didn't trust. The evidence tells me the chances are slim it was not him." The judge ruled that Christopher's defense team could in fact introduce evidence that would implicate Sam and Emmanuel as the murderers. He also ruled that the prosecuting attorneys could not bring up in court the fact that Christopher worked at funeral homes in the past. They couldn't talk about his Hannibal Lecter tattoo. They couldn't talk about his online activity in the deviant art community or his time spent interacting on forums about serial killers. Though this information was all over the news. The television show 48 Hours had also been covering the story for a future episode. All of this publicity would cause issues pertaining to the jurors who were being chosen, because it would be hard to find people who had not been inundated with all the information by way of extensive news coverage. John Brown did file a motion for a change of venue, but even then it would be difficult to find an unbiased jury. On May 23, 2012, the jury had been selected, but Christopher decided to take a new plea deal that he was offered, which wasn't as good as the first, but still, it was better than what he would have gotten had he gone to trial. He pleaded guilty to first-degree manslaughter of Mackenzie Cowell, first-degree robbery for stealing her cell phone, and second-degree assault on a woman that was unrelated to Mackenzie's case in exchange for 14 years in prison. Christopher said he was innocent, and he only took the plea deal because he figured he would never be able to get a fair trial. He claimed that 80% of the possible jurors wrote on their questionnaires that they did believe he was guilty, and they'd allegedly seen evidence that was ordered by the judge not to be brought in at all during the trial. But those things had been exposed already in the media. Mackenzie was said to be a very bright and trusting person. She, to some extent, obviously trusted Christopher, and he betrayed that trust, luring her to her ultimate demise. Prosecutor Gary said in court, quote, "The loss of a 17-year-old girl isn't something one can put a value on in the criminal justice system. It's a case where the result of today's hearing probably won't be satisfactory to anyone, but I think it does bring some closure." In June of 2012, 32-year-old Theo Keyes, the man that wrote the letter to the police about Christopher Wilson possibly being Mackenzie's killer, was on his way to collect $38,000 of reward money. He had previously been given $2,000 in the spring of 2011 from Mackenzie's mother, Wendy. The money had been collected by Mackenzie's friends at a fundraiser they held on Mackenzie's 18th birthday. Theo, a musician who suffers from bipolar disorder and schizoaffective disorder, was known to help police in the past. In 2006, Theo discovered a gun tossed away in an alley by someone who stole a car and sped away. He took the gun to the police. Theo was writing the letters to police from the Springfield, Oregon City Jail, where he was serving 18 days for felony indecency. He had exposed his private parts to a barista in April of 2010 and pleaded guilty in July of 2010. He also told police about Christopher choking a woman, Shauna Novak, a few months before Mackenzie's murder in his apartment after Shauna had spent the night. Christopher allegedly let go of her throat and led her out of his apartment. Shauna's testimony was thrown out since there would be no trial. Theo did act erratic before and after he sent in tips to the police. Not only had he exposed himself to the barista, after his release, he went to Wenatchee, and soon after, a woman got a restraining order against him. This woman said that Theo was constantly harassing her with texts, calling her nonstop, and pestering her on Facebook. Then, in March of 2011, Theo went into Christopher Wilson's mother's salon and started screaming, quote, "Christopher Wilson is a murderer." He was prohibited from approaching Christopher's mother for a year. After that incident, he left Wenatchee and went to Bellingham. In mid-November of 2012, while in prison, Christopher was asked if he ever thought about getting the Hannibal Lecter tattoo on his forearm removed. As he looked at the fictional serial killer tattoo on his arm, he said, quote, "Many, many times, I've wanted to get it removed. I looked into getting Wrecking Balm, that ointment that you can put on that extracts tattoos. A lot of different things. It's just time and money are a huge factor. A lot of people are identified by their tattoos, so if you're altering them, it's a security risk." Christopher was referring to Washington's penitentiaries not allowing tattoo removals or alterations. If you do that, it's a law violation. Later, Christopher Wilson would attempt to take back his plea of guilty in a motion to the Washington Court of Appeals, but it was rejected. He still denied killing Mackenzie Cowell when he was interviewed for 5 hours for the Wenatchee World, and in letters, telephone calls, and the 48 Hours episode in 2012. Christopher was mad at John Brown because he thought maybe John was too distracted with his other client, Army Staff Sergeant Robert Bales, who was accused of murdering 16 civilians in Afghanistan. Christopher wanted his case reopened to, quote, charge the right people. He claimed the DNA on the duct tape was not his. He wanted to know if the 2 other suspects before him, Sam and Emmanuel, were drug informants for the police. There was a Facebook page created called Free Christopher Wilson after the episode of 48 Hours aired. People began to question if Christopher was really guilty. They thought maybe he was guilty but did not act alone in the murder. And if he did act alone, could he have had help moving Mackenzie's body from his apartment to the riverside? Some people wondered if Sam and Emmanuel were the real killers who did actually have a video of the murder, as Liz Reed had said, but retracted. However, people that did believe he was innocent or wanted to believe he was tried to come up with a reasonable explanation for Mackenzie's blood being found in the carpet padding and on the duct tape. A Change.org petition that is now closed down was once created to, quote, get justice for Mackenzie, reopen Christopher Wilson's case, and charge the right people. The description states, quote, Christopher Wilson was wrongfully accused of Mackenzie Cowell's murder and railroaded into taking a plea deal for manslaughter. The evidence that was provided on Christopher was all circumstantial, and even the prosecutor himself alluded that they did not have the evidence to convict him. There is DNA found at the crime scene on cigarette butts, the murder weapon, Mackenzie's car, etc., from at least 4 different males. None of it matches Christopher Wilson. There are 2 men, Samuel Cuevas and Emmanuel Serros, who had worked as police informants on the drug task force, who admitted to involvement in Mackenzie's murder. These men, as well as the Chelan County law enforcement, should be investigated. As always, I would love to know your thoughts about this. John Brown did respond to Christopher's angry jabs, saying, quote, the DNA in his carpet was an insurmountable fact, unless we could seriously convince a jury that it was planted. We did a great job, and all know that. It is time for Chris to stop fighting and start accepting. Christopher said that if it was Mackenzie's blood on his carpet, that he had no clue how it got there. Quote, it wasn't placed there by me or anybody I know. There's no possible way it could have been in my apartment. About the jurors who would have had his life in their hands, who saw the police affidavit, had, quote, painted the picture that Christopher was a dark person with a fictional serial killer tattoo and had premeditated this murder, Christopher said, quote, until I really saw it there and heard it from the jurors and saw it in the questionnaires, I didn't know how bad it really was. I thought that some of the things you started reporting would have gotten through, would have made people ask questions, and it seemed like it was too late at that point. Obviously, it didn't make that big of a dent in the opinion that was already formed. When asked about turning down the first plea deal, he said, quote, I did not want to plead to something I didn't do. I didn't want to take 6 years. I wouldn't have taken 6 months at the time. I was extremely convinced that if I were to get a fair trial, everything that could have come out would have proved that I had nothing to do with this. And it wasn't until I read the jury questionnaires from 2 different panels, and each panel, 85% of the jurors, said, "Oh, he's guilty, forget it." Before accepting the plea deal that he did, when the judge asked if he murdered Mackenzie Cowell, he paused before saying yes. Mackenzie's brother, Colby, who was 23 at the time, spoke in the courtroom to Christopher, quote, "You're man enough to take my sister away from me and my family. I just want you to be man enough to look me in the eyes and tell me why. Are you able to do that?" About that, in the interview, Christopher said, quote, "I wanted to say no so bad. I wanted to look Mr. Cowell and Wendy Cowell in the eye and tell them, I did not do this to your daughter. I did not do this to your sister. But at that point, it was done." Colby got no response at all from Christopher in the courtroom, so at the end of his statement, he said, quote, "I'll make you a promise. Regardless of how long you are in jail or how long you live on this earth, you're gonna burn forever." When Mackenzie's dad was asked what he believed Christopher's motive was, he responded, quote, "He had a fascination with death and finally had an opportunity and the nerve to make it happen. I think he had an interest in what it would feel like." Detectives outside of the courthouse agreed. This transcript I'm about to read to you is from the Wenatchee World, posted by Jefferson Robbins. I'll have the link to the article in the show notes. These are parts of the 5-hour interview the Wenatchee World conducted with Christopher Wilson on November 14th, 2012. The Wenatchee World. What did they tell you in that August meeting? Christopher: I was interviewed by Tim Scott, and he said, "Hey, we're going through the list of students, and my name came up. Would I be willing to come down and give a DNA swab and a statement?" I said, "Yeah, no problem." So I went down to East Wenatchee. I believe it was the sheriff's office. The Wenatchee World. It's like that little bunker building, about 2 or 3 stories, I guess. Christopher: Yeah, so I went in there, and it was one of their little interrogation rooms. I gave a voluntary swab and talked for about 25 minutes, half an hour, and that was it. Did Detective Scott give you any reason to think they were looking at you as a suspect? He responded, "Not at all. He just said that they were going through a list of students, and so I didn't have any reason to believe otherwise." Did you have any trepidation about giving the DNA swab? Christopher said, "Not at all. I said, absolutely, that's fine. I don't have anything to hide." And so the process, as I recall, is just like a Q-tip inside your mouth? Christopher said, "Yeah, he did, I think, several of them. They swabbed my cheek, the inside of my cheek." And you'd never been arrested for anything before. Your DNA wouldn't have been in any system, I guess. Never, no. And you'd never had a DNA sample taken at any other time, to your knowledge. No. If you thought about it now, you had the option to refuse, what would you do? Christopher said, "I'd still do it. I still don't have anything to hide. I just wish I would have had an attorney present or something. I guess that really wouldn't have made a difference. I still would have given one, but yeah, I guess I still would have given one." If, in fact, Chris, they did find DNA matching your type, your 1 in 1,100 type, at the same place where Mackenzie's body was, how do you think that DNA type would have gotten on that duct tape? He said, "I don't know. I know that it was inconclusive. That's all I know. I know it's not my DNA. I know that it would have been... It's not. It's impossible for that to be my DNA. I know that there's DNA from 2 other males on the duct tape as well, but there's no way it's my DNA." "What is that stain in the old apartment?" Christopher said, "There's several different stains. If we're talking about the one shown in the video that Tessa took, where she recorded my entire kitchen, bedroom, floors, everything, there's a bong stain, and there's lightly colored carpet in the middle of my living room that she zoomed up on. That's all it was, is a stain from bong water. You might not know that bong water smells extremely terrible, and I tried to remove it with simple green, and it discolored the carpet, and that was it. That's all." "So, what is that stain? Is that stain Mackenzie Cowell's blood?" "No, that stain is from simple green. It's not even a stain. It's light-colored carpet. That's it. That's the only thing that was on my carpet." So the crime lab was going to say Mackenzie Cowell's blood turned up in this carpet. Christopher responded, "They were going to say the piece of material that they received, because they never received my carpet. They received a piece of material, or 2 pieces of material, that were 4 centimeters in length. They were going to say that Mackenzie Cowell's blood was on those 2 pieces of material." "How did that get there?" Christopher said, "I have no idea. It wasn't placed there by me or anybody I know. I know that her blood, there's no possible way it could have been in my apartment." "Who else had access to your apartment?" "I don't think anybody really had access as far as being there when I wasn't there, unless I gave the keys to somebody, but I don't believe I did around that time at all." "Why do you think you?" "Why do I think me? I don't think it had so much to do with the way I looked, which I know has been suggested. I think that probably helped after my arrest. It helped cultivate this weird, I don't know, image, I suppose. But I believe at the time, law enforcement was under public scrutiny. This is, 8 months later, there hasn't been an arrest? They were spending thousands and thousands of dollars on this investigation, this huge task force. All of a sudden, they have DNA that I couldn't necessarily be linked to, but I couldn't be ruled out from, and that's it. That's what they arrested me on, and went to the newspapers with and said, 'Oh, we got our guy.' And it wasn't like, 'Well, we're holding somebody who could possibly be involved.' It's, 'We got our guy.' That was it. They didn't arrest me and do some investigating to see whether or not it would have even been possible. They just ran with it." "Did you ever want to kill somebody?" "No, not at all, no." The reporter from the Wenatchee World jokingly said, "I have." Christopher responded, "Well, I haven't." The Wenatchee World reporter said, "I mean, in a theoretical sense, it's not like I've sought to kill somebody, but..." Christopher said, "No, I've never been angry enough or had any desire to hurt anybody at all." The reporter said, "Their characterization is it wouldn't be a question of anger. It would be a question of Chris Wilson is curious about death and wants to act out a death, and this is the girl that he chose." Christopher said, "See, I volunteered to talk to psychiatrists or whoever they want to throw at me. I don't care, you know? I'm not obsessed with death. I'm not obsessed with murder. There's nothing to indicate that I am. I mean, they used this Hannibal Lecter tattoo from 2002, and the fact that I worked at a funeral home for maybe a year and a half, and that's it. There's not a single image of violence or murder on my computer or anywhere in my apartment. I'm not talking to anybody about hurting anyone. I don't understand how they can say this without backing it up with anything except for an old tattoo and an old job. You were offered at least one other plea deal prior to that one you accepted. I was. And that was going to translate to about 6.5 years. Correct, yes. What happened to that deal? That was gonna be a manslaughter plea. It was. To first degree, which was the same as what you eventually pled to, right? It was. The reporter asked, or was it second degree manslaughter? I can't remember. Christopher responded, I believe it was first degree manslaughter with a weapon enhancement or something like that. I did not want to plead to something I didn't do. I didn't want to take 6 years, or as I'm sure you saw my mom say on 48 Hours, I told her I didn't want to take... I wouldn't have even taken 6 months at the time. I was extremely convinced that if I were to get a fair trial, everything that could have come out would have proved that I had nothing to do with this. And it wasn't until I read the jury questionnaires from 2 different panels, and each panel, 85% of the jurors said, oh, he's guilty, forget it. And the reporter butted in. You saw these questionnaires yourself? My lawyer showed me. Yeah, they just said really weird things. I mean, I don't know if you were there or not, but there was this guy when we called jurors in individually to ask them about some of their responses to the questions. One guy said I was diabolical. And then you had this husband who came in and said his wife's on the jury panel as well, and he said he wouldn't be able to be unbiased because his wife has such a strong opinion about me. So they brought his wife in, and his wife totally lied about knowing anything about the case or knowing anything about me. And so when you see the jurors lying to get on the jury panel, or potential jurors lying to get on the jury panel, and even the judge is pulling my attorney aside saying, look, you might want to talk to your client about taking a deal, because look what this says, look what this says, look what this says. It's like there's no hope, there's no chance, What did you think about that revelation, that you were facing people who might be on a jury panel who already had a real solid idea about guilt or innocence? I didn't know what to think about it at first. I don't have access to, or I didn't have access to the internet or what was being said online about me or anything like that, and family and friends are not going to tell you every terrible detail or every terrible thing that's being said, so I didn't know what to expect. And after seeing people come in and reading what they had to say, it blew me away that people are so trusting of everything they read, or so trusting of their law enforcement when there's so many contradictions that even an idiot could pick out or understand, And it's like it was just being ignored or swept under the rug. So that was extremely, I don't know the word for it. It's pretty shocking, I guess. It was depressing. It was, I guess, really disappointing. When you accepted your plea and you were asked by the judge to essentially restate your plea publicly in your own words, he read you the statement on plea of guilty which said, quote, I caused the death of Mackenzie Cowell. I stole a ring. I attacked Shauna Novak. He said that, and he said, quote, is that your statement? And you said, yes. Right. Pretty promptly, and then he asked, is that what you did? Which is not something that I expected him to do. That's not something that's in the usual routine of what judges do. He said, is that what you did? And you gave this little pause, and then you said yes. That pause always kind of troubled me, so I sort of wanted to ask what was happening in your mind when you paused before saying yes. I wanted to say, no, I didn't do this. And at that point, with both the jury questionnaires that I had read and what I believe John Henry Brown's, I don't think he was up to speed on my case, and that was something we discussed the first day of jury selection. I think the combination of the two is what led me to take it, and I wanted to say no so bad. I wanted to look Mr. Cowell and Wendy Cowell in the eye and tell them that I did not do this to your daughter, I did not do this to your sister. But at that point, it was done. Do you wish you'd taken that 6 to 7 year plea deal now? Yes and no. I wish I would have gone to trial. Even if I was convicted, at least everything would be out there and it would be a lot easier to appeal. And I think that would have opened a lot of people's eyes, just hearing the facts come out in court. Whether I was found guilty or not, I think it would have been a good thing to have all of that out there. So to answer your question, do I wish I would have taken it? Some days I do, but more often than not, I wish I would have gone to trial. And that concludes that interview with the Wenatchee World. Right now, Christopher is in the Clallam Bay Correction Center, but he could be released on parole this year. Again, I would love to know your thoughts on this case. You can reach out on social media on Twitter at Reverie Crime Pod, Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Reverie True Crime, or send me an email at reveриetruecrime@gmail.com. Thank you for listening to this week's episode. Until next time, everyone, please stay safe out there and take care of yourselves and each other.